All right, we wish you early on here a Merry Christmas, so great Advent season of thinking about our Savior. And we want to look this year, we do different things. I've preached on Christmas quite a few years. You've probably heard a lot of messages on Christmas if you've been in the church for a while. For many of us, it's one of our favorite seasons. And even if it's not your absolute favorite, the thought that God loved the world so much, loved you, loved me so much, that he sent his son to be born of the Virgin Mary, to be a baby and grow into the man, the God-man who would die on the cross. And so we want to contemplate that. As a pastor, it's challenging sometimes because if you've been in church a few years, you've heard quite a few Christmas messages. So you're trying to be in the Bible, but hopefully a little different. This one's a little different. We're hanging around Bethlehem a little bit. And so the series next few weeks will take us around the environs of Bethlehem. And I spoke with Gail briefly. She said she did get to be there. And so there is, what's that?
3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago. She was there just recently. You can imagine it would be getting very crowded about now, because that's a highlight for a lot of Christian tourists to visit Bethlehem. And anyways, that's the modern city, interesting, and there's some sites there, the Church of Nativity, I imagine you got to see, and so on. We're going to consider it from the biblical text this morning. If you want to take your Bibles and open to Luke chapter 2, we're going to begin there, but we will not stay there. We're going to be in a couple other places, but if you would go with me to Luke chapter 2. And again, this is the story that is the most central. This is the actual narrative. This is the Luke's account of when the Christ child was born. That they came to Bethlehem, and Mary. There's no room in the inn, and she has the Christ child, the Son of God, born there in Bethlehem. And so, very familiar text. And what I'm going to do here, the question I'm looking at in this series and in the beginning today is, I'm looking kind of in verse number 4. They leave. There's a census or a taxation that's proclaimed by the Roman government. And so Mary and his espoused wife, and that's its own story. That's part of the Christmas, the Virgin Mary, before they had come together, she is found to be with child of the Holy Spirit. A miracle of God, because it's the Son of God, the God-man. But in any event, there's a taxation or a census, and they head to out of Galilee, where they live, where they're from, and they head to the city of David, one of the names for Bethlehem, the city of David, which is called Bethlehem because Joseph, and actually Mary too, but because Joseph is of the house and lineage of David. So we want to explore that a little bit. Why is Bethlehem significant in this Christmas story? And how did we get here? So if you can imagine that this is kind of a storytelling of it, a narrative of the Christmas event, or even a film or a movie, and we're right at this point. The scene opens, and here is Joseph and Mary, and they are about to have baby Jesus there in Bethlehem. They're headed there to Bethlehem. And what I'm going to do is do a flashback. We're going to go back in time and figure out, why is Bethlehem important? Why is it significant? What's going on? How did we get to Luke chapter 2 in the Christmas story and arrive at Bethlehem? And so I want to back up in the story of the Bible, back up in the text of the Bible, and make some connections for you today and over the next couple, 3 weeks. And so let's take a little journey. Let's take a little trip on the road to Bethlehem. Back up with me, actually, quite a bit of time and quite a bit of Bible text to the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth. And I'm going to guess you've probably not heard a ton of messages for Christmas out of the book of Ruth. And so hopefully this will both give you a little bit of insight into the book of Ruth, and stir your interest in the Christmas story once again. But I want to cover a few things here. I want to go over a few things about the book of Ruth. We'll spend here a few minutes. I'm actually going to read a chunk of Ruth. And so you let the Bible, in its own words, give you the story. But we want to look at 3 or 4 things. You will recollect, if you remember the story of Ruth, that it is, in large part, a love story. There are three main characters, and I'm going to read some of this and make comment along. So it's going to be kind of, this portion of the message is reading Ruth and making some background comments. But it is a love story. There are three main characters. We normally think of the title character Ruth because she's the main one, but actually Naomi plays a major role. We won't spend a lot of time commenting on her today, but if you'll notice as we read from beginning to end, she starts out, and she is an Israelite. She's a Jewish woman who has a faith in God, but she'll say of herself that she is bitter. Some things go poorly in life, and she even says, "Don't call me Naomi, call me," if you remember the story, "call me Mara," which is the Hebrew word for bitter. God has dealt hard with me. And again, not our main point today, but you'll see by the end of the story, God has worked in her heart and there's a transformation. She has come back to praising God. Ruth is the main character, of course, the loyal one. And what's interesting about this in a comment fashion is she is not Israelite. She is a Moabite. She is a Moabitess. And actually not part of the chosen people of God, but she is brought into the family of God, brought into the children of Israel by marriage. And she has a character of loyalty. And we'll read it. You remember one of those phrases when she says to Naomi, "I'm not going to leave you. Your God will be my God. Your people my people." We'll read it in a moment. And then actually Boaz is a main character here as well. And he is the near relative, the kinsman. We'll talk about that briefly. Again, this is just kind of the broad background of the book of Ruth. And we'll notice along the way, I kind of missed the life and times. This as we read it here, let me read the first few verses, chapter 1, 1 to 5, and discuss this for just a minute, and then we'll read some more in Ruth. But here's the opening to give us the location and the life and times of the book of Ruth. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem, do notice Bethlehem throughout this study, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. Probably not names that we would all pick, but there you go. They were Ephrathites, which is another word for Bethlehemites. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died. And she was left with her 2 sons. The 2 sons took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. All right, and so this is, again, very succinct opening, but we have a couple things. I do notice the life and time. This is written in the time that this occurs, during the time of the judges. And so in terms of dates, we're talking about in between Moses and Joshua. So Moses, if you recollect your dates, is in the vicinity of 1440, 1440, 1444, something like that, BC, is the Exodus. And then 40 years of wandering, so you're down to about 1400 approximately. And then Joshua and the conquest. And that lasts for, a couple decades or so. Joshua and the conquest. We then enter the period of the judges. So we're thinking the book of Judges, and that's when this takes place. During that time, there is no real leader in Israel. They have these judges or leaders that sprout up. Gideon and Barak and Samson and so on. Some are pretty good, some aren't. Some of them are concurrent with one another. But there's a period of a couple hundred years, probably 1375 until the kingdom under Saul starts about 1050. So we've got 250 years, and Ruth is somewhere in here, kind of a disoriented, kind of a period of time when things are a little bit wild in the culture and so on. And that's when this story appears. And so we see that. We want to see a few things here. I want to read a little further into the text And I'm going to read rather quickly because of the time, but I want to cover some of this out of Ruth for the background setting of the significance of Bethlehem. I'm in chapter 1, verse 6. So allow me to read here a bit. Verse 6, Then she arose, that's namely with her daughters-in-law, to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, No, we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for is it exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. Notice Naomi's attitude at this point. And then verse 14, Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. We see that she's going to stick with it. She's loyal. Verse 15, and she said, that is Ruth, she said, Naomi says, See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. And so in the next few verses, they return, and you'll notice again in verse 21, as they get into the area of Bethlehem, which is where Elimelech, the deceased husband, is from. They return to that area, and the people address is this Naomi, and in verse 20 she says, Don't call me Naomi, which means pleasant. Instead, she says, Call me Mara, meaning bitter, for the Almighty, for God has dealt very bitterly away with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? And so you can see in this is a subplot of the story of this book, that Naomi is working through life's issues with God, and currently her attitude, openly stated, is, don't even give me my real name because God's hard on me. Call me bitter. God's been bitter to me. In any event, in chapter 2, we are introduced to the third of the 3 main characters, Boaz, another man of Bethlehem, pretty well-to-do and well-established, has property and so on, has fields, and it is in those fields. Again, if you're picturing this in your mind as sort of a play or a video, we would have that. We would shift scenes from this conversation in town between the ladies, call me bitter, out to the fields, and we're going to have Ruth and Boaz meet. You know the story. It is a love story. They are going to fall in love, and at the end, they marry. But in this, they meet. And so let me read a little bit further in chapter 2. Now, Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said, Go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, to the other workers, The Lord be with you. And they answered, The Lord bless you. Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, Whose young woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers. So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. And we could carry on from there, but the chapter goes on to have this scene of her gleaning, which, by the way, is one of the practices actually spelled out in the law. If we had longer, we could look up a couple of those texts, but there is actual provision in the Mosaic law for the farmers to leave the edges of their fields for those who were poor, destitute, to come and glean. So this was a practice of that day, to provide for those in special need. And so Boaz was doing this, and in fact, through the story, he actually is very generous. He actually, I wish we had longer to read the whole thing, but he is going to tell his reapers, don't just leave the edges like we're required to, but even pull some out of your own sheaves and kind of leave them for Ruth and make it easier for her. And he gives her some things. And so they meet actually in verse 8. Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter." He goes and talks to her. "Do not go to glean in any other field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be in the field that they are reaping. Go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when they are thirsty, go to the vessels. And when you are thirsty, rather, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." Then she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before." In verse 12, "The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." Then she said, "I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not one of your servants." And so we have this interaction that's going to develop along the way. And as we go into, she does this for several weeks, it appears, during the barley harvest. And we get to, the rest of that chapter continues that, and she does well. Boaz is kind to her day after day, and so on. We get to chapter 3, and Naomi, her mother-in-law, says to Ruth, "My daughter, should I not seek rest? Should I make some inquiry? Should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." And she replied, "All that you say, I will do." And so there's some interesting customs that happen here during the harvest season. Naomi instructs Ruth to do this towards the end of the day when she has eaten, when Boaz has eaten and drunk, is full and satisfied and lies down. Again, it sounds strange to my ear, probably sounds strange to your ear, but she instructs Ruth to go and observe where he lies down on the threshing floor and then lie down at his feet. And you recall the story. He is startled awake in the night. And what happens is, as he wakes up and he says, "Who is this?" And she says, "It's Ruth." And he realizes that the custom, there's a custom here, that she is looking for his protection, for his redemption. And so let's talk for just a minute. I have here the kinsman, Boaz the kinsman. This is one of those very interesting parts of this story. There is a term called the kinsman redeemer. The kinsman redeemer. And Boaz was part of this. He was a near relative to Elimelech. And so there was, in this time period in Israel, an interest in preserving the family line and the family lands. And when Naomi had come back, she came back destitute and was going to have to lose everything, lose her lands, lose what belonged to her. And in doing this, Boaz says, "I will come forward and be that kinsman redeemer." When we get into chapter 4, and again, I'll summarize it for sake of time, but there was one person, one kinsman who had a near relationship, a closer relative, and he presented in the morning after Ruth lay at his feet, he went and to the city gate, and that's where they conducted business, and spoke to this other kinsman, this other relative, and said, "It's time to take care of this. Naomi needs assistance, needs redemption of her property," and so on. And the guy said, I'd be happy to do that. At that moment, it would be a pickup of some property. He'd be helping out a relative, and he would be increasing his lands. And then Boaz says, if you notice in verse 5, Boaz says, when you redeem it, the day that you redeem it, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite. And then the guy says, well, wait a second, that would jeopardize my land. That would jeopardize my inheritance and my holdings. And so I won't do it. I can't do it. You do it. And Boaz steps forward and says, I will do it. And there's a little thing here, not only an interesting love story mixed in with some customs of that day, customs that we're not used to. This isn't how we do things here in America, but these were customs of that day. But it does seem to be there's probably some level of the kinsman redeemer is at least a type or a picture of Christ as the kinsman redeemer. He's the one that comes in and redeems us. He pays the price for us. But I want to move forward here and look at three things for just a few moments. This is more the Christmas part of it, of why Bethlehem is important. So in Luke 2, they travel to Bethlehem. The question is why? Why'd they go there? Well, there's a clue in Luke chapter 2, because Joseph was of the house and lineage of David. And so I want to give you three things here for just a few moments as we consider some of these things out of the story of Ruth. Number one is the land. This land is an important one. What's going to happen here is the reason Joseph in Luke chapter 2 goes back to Bethlehem is because that is the ancestral home. This goes all the way back to this book, to the book of Ruth, when the beginnings of Joseph's heritage, Joseph's lineage, start in the book of Ruth. And this land that Boaz redeems, when he buys the property and when he marries Ruth, that land becomes theirs. And it becomes the ancestral property of that line out of which Joseph comes and Mary as well. But Joseph is the one that's mentioned. And so in short, it appears that when the Christmas story in Luke chapter 2 occurs, the census is called, the taxation is going to happen, they travel back to Bethlehem, to the ancestral property. You know, for us, some of us would be like going back to our old stomping grounds is kind of our wording for it. But they go back to the ancestral property. And I think what the Bible is saying is that where Jesus was born was on the Davidic property. This is the property of the line of David for centuries. This is what they owned. And so there's a land issue. They went back to the ancestral property. Secondly, there's a lineage issue. And I want to look at that. We're back in the text here. If you look at it in verse 13, chapter 4, verse 13, and it says this, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. Then Naomi took the child and laid him up on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi. They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. And then the last couple verses. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse. And Jesse fathered David. And so in this little book, we have this incredible love story. We have some things going on with the character of Ruth, her loyalty, her love for God, her love for Naomi, her love for Boaz. We have the transformation of Naomi from bitter back to pleasant, back to Naomi who trusts in God. And we see the character of Boaz in the middle of this, the kinsman redeemer. He's not given a lot of detail, but he's a man of character, a man of good character. But underneath it, one of the key things that's going on is the land of Bethlehem, the ancestral property of the David family. And not only that, the Davidic lineage, the line of Boaz to Obed, Obed to Jesse, and Jesse to David. This is the root story behind the Christmas tale of why Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And so there's some neat things here. Back to the family farm, back to the roots in Ruth. I wanted to give you one more thing as we close. Go with me back to chapter 2. And I did read this verse, but I want you to see it one more time. Ruth chapter 2. And it's verse number 12. Ruth 2 and verse 12. And there's kind of an interesting thought here with a practical challenge on it. I'm calling it legacy here, but verse 12. The Lord, this is in the middle of their conversation, and Boaz says to Ruth, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel. And then this phrase, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. I'm going to guess in this group here in our congregation this morning that there's some family sayings that take place. I was trying to remember some things I learned from my mom or dad. I didn't have tons of catchwords, but I remember one. My dad was a pastor and a preacher and a teacher and so on. But one he would say from time to time was, especially when something happened, like there was a near accident and God spared us or something like that. He would say something like, we're tokens of God's blessing and grace every day. We're just tokens of God's blessing and grace every day. I remember as he got a little bit older, I think he was thinking forward to heaven and glory. And he would say something, especially when things were tough or if there were difficulties going on, he would say, something to the effect, it won't be long before we'll all be in glory. Just a couple of expressions. Maybe you have some that you use. What I want to do is take just a moment and close this morning with this. I'm calling it the legacy, but this phrase out of Ruth 2:12, under the shadow, you've come under the wings, you've come to take refuge. The God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. And I want to suggest to you, I think this was picked up in the family line and came all the way down to David. It's just a suggestion, but I'm going to show you 3 or 4 places, this under his wings. These are all, I'm going to give you 3, I think it is 3 Davidic Psalms. One is Psalm 17, and verse 7, wondrously show your steadfast love. Savior of those who seek refuge from their adversaries, your right hand. Keep me as the apple of your eye. And then the last phrase there is what? Hide me in the shadow of your wings. David, this is a Davidic psalm. It is titled as such. And it's the same phrase, the shadow of your wings, under your wings. He's going to use it again in Psalm 36:7, another Davidic psalm, in which he says, how precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. And of course, there's a practical devotional thought here for you personally. Do you understand? Have you taken refuge under the shadow of the wings of God? He is one who cares. How precious is your steadfast love, O God. The children of mankind take refuge in the shadow of your wings. One other one, I think it's found once or twice more, but this one, Psalm 61. Let me dwell in your tent forever. Let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. Selah. And so my suggestion here is it sounds like maybe it became a family saying. It sounds like it came from Boaz, but it developed down through the great-grandchild David, and he puts it in the Psalms and he uses his expression, may God help us. May you find refuge under the shadow of God's wings. And I have two parts of that. One is, do you understand that issue? Do you find refuge in God? When times are tough, when things are troubling, when life is hard, have you come to rest? Have you come to find peace and shelter under the wings of God and find refuge there? By the way, I think Jesus said something like this, did he not? When he saw Jerusalem, of course, Jesus being in the line of David. Do you remember when he was standing over Jerusalem? He said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I've longed to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks. It sounds like a similar phrase. But I want to challenge you one step further. In your family, in your life, what's your faith legacy? The previous question was, do you understand about being under the shadow of God's wings? Do you find comfort there? But what are you passing on to your children, to your grandchildren? I'm not saying come up with a catchy phrase that doesn't hurt, but I'm saying, what are you passing on? A sense of God's reality? Do you pass on to them the liveliness of your own faith? What kind of faith example are you demonstrating, not only to your children, but to those around you in speech? Maybe it's the words you use, the expressions you use, but also in actions. And so I find in this Bethlehem trek, or the road to Bethlehem, and the roots in Ruth, we've seen several things. The land, it does seem to be the ancestral property. It's the lineage. This is the beginnings of the line of David in the story of Ruth. And then this, just a little thought for today, the legacy. Out of this man, Boaz, came this idea, God is God who cares. He shelters us under his wings. And it shows up in David's Psalms on a few occasions. What kind of legacy are you and I passing on to our children? We ought to ponder that. We want to close this part of the service by singing a song that matches that. Under His Wings, I think, captures that pretty well. It is in Your Majesty hymn book number 87. Hymn number 87.